Hello and welcome to episode 275 of AvTalk. I am Ian Petchnick here as always with
Jason Rabinowitz. Ian, it sounds like you're talking fast, like we got a lot to cover.
We gotta go. You said that you needed to record early today, so I assume you had somewhere to be. But we also have a lot to talk about because, oh boy, did a lot happen this week.
Part of that is true. I have nowhere to be. I just knew we'd have a lot to talk about.
You knew we had a lot to talk about.
Half of it being Boeing.
Yeah, half the show is going to be Boeing. It didn't have to be Boeing.
But it is. As is usually the case with Boeing, isn't it?
So here's where we start. I'll start with the NTSB's headline because, man, it's a bad one. The NTSB's headline on the press release says, Boeing sanctioned for sharing non-public investigative information with media on 737 MAX 9 door plug investigation. That's Yikes. Really bad.
Yikes. Yeah, NTSB was not pulling any punches about what happened here, which they were quite preemptive as well. I think what they're talking about here was during a media briefing that was still embargoed by the time NTSB actually said, what the hell are you doing? So they really jumped ahead of this one before the public even knew what they were talking about.
I'm going to quote from the press release here. Elizabeth Lund, the Senior Vice President for Quality at Boeing Commercial Airplanes, gave a long-planned media briefing, and I'm going to add some emphasis here, without the knowledge or consent of the NTSB. Continuing the quote. At which she released non-public investigative information and made unsubstantiated speculations about possible causes of the January 5th door plug blowout, which is directly at issue in the ongoing investigation. We have verified that part of the released information was either inaccurate or unknown to the NTSB, while other parts were not previously disclosed to the public. End quote.
Ooh.
Oh, boy.
Yeah.
That's not good.
No, I think somewhere in this release, I can't find it right now, but they said, oh, here it is. As a party to many NTSB investigations over the past decades, few entities know the rules better than Boeing. Yeah, that's a forceful statement. Basically just saying you should know better and you do know better, but you did this anyway. And not just during an off-the-cuff remark to someone in an interview where you may have gotten sidetracked. These were allegedly prepared remarks given to media explicitly with forethought here. So this wasn't an accident. This didn't happen because somebody just didn't think it off the cuff in the moment that they shouldn't be saying that. This was calculated, and the NTSB is not happy about it. And there are consequences for such behavior.
Well, let's back up before we get to the consequences and talk about why this is a big deal and why the NTSB can say it's sanctioning.
Let's figure out what Boeing did say.
Let's talk about what Lund said during this and how this unfolded. Media were invited to Boeing's Renton facility early last week as part of the...
must have gotten lost in the mail.
It must have. Yeah. As part of the run-up to the Farnborough Air Show, which Boeing Commercial Airplanes isn't really attending. They're not sending demonstration aircraft.
We talked about that last week and how it was a good decision.
Right. But they were holding media briefings pre-show to really hammer home that they're taking seriously the changes that need to be made in order to improve Boeing's quality in its manufacturing process. So that's the background for Lund's comments. And Lund was speaking to a group of assembled reporters, including our good friend John Ostrower at the Air Current, Dominic Gates at the Seattle Times. I believe Chris Van Cleve from CBS News was there, amongst others. And here's what she said. She was walking through what Boeing believes happened in the lead up to the door plug failing and being blown out of the aircraft. She said that the fuselage for N704AL, which is the aircraft that Alaska Airlines eventually took delivery of, came from Wichita, from Spirit Aerosystems, to Boeing in Renton with 5 non-conforming rivets. And we've talked about this. This is all part of the information that was released in the preliminary report by the NTSB. So we're not necessarily in hot water quite yet.
Nothing interesting.
She was explaining how while Boeing and Spirit were discussing how best to address those non-conforming rivets. What do they need to replace? How can they fix it? What's the best way to do it? Who's going to do the work? All of these things. The airplane continued to move down the assembly line through the Renton plant. By the time Boeing and Spirit decided how and what needed to be done to address the non-conforming rivets on the aircraft had already reached the end of the assembly line. So here's what happened next, and this is where things get dicey for Boeing as far as what they're saying to the media and why the NTSB got so upset. Lund says that they then found a non-compliance with our process. The plug was opened without the correct paperwork. Now we're getting into some territory where the NTSB is unhappy that these things are being said. There was documentation on the actual rivet work. That was properly documented. But by the time the rivets were fixed, the airplane was ready to go outside. Lund says that Boeing has what's called a move crew or move team. That team's job is to ensure that all of the holes in the airplane are covered before the plane leaves the actual factory building for the first time. That team did not reinstall the retaining pins, so the 4 bolts that are necessary to keep that plug in permanently. She says that this was not their job because any open job is done later in the process. But there was no open paperwork because what she's saying is that when they took the bolts out, when they took those retaining pins out to open the plug in order to fix the rivets, they only documented the rivet fix. They didn't document the fact that they had removed the bolts from the plug.
And this is almost a callback to months ago where the NTSB was requesting paperwork that did not exist, and Boeing just outright said, we can't provide paperwork that does not exist.
Right. And so there was no open paperwork that had traveled with the aircraft. Pictures were taken during the what they call the OK to close process that showed 3 of the 4 missing bolts. And that picture has been circulated as part of the NTSB released photographs. So all good here as far as what we're talking about. But this new information about the move crew, that was not known. And it sounds like the NTSB didn't know about this information. So that, not good.
Not good, but
now,
there's more.
There's more. Here's where the NTSB really, really got upset. In response to a question by a journalist, Lund said that the who, meaning determining who actually did this removal and didn't do the paperwork, is absolutely the responsibility of the NTSB.
And that's a quote that you're reciting there. Yes, that is not emphasis.
So this is
the who is absolutely.
That's a direct quote from a recording that was captured by John Ostrower during the events in the Renton factory.
So stop me if you've heard this before. The NTSB does not assign fault or blame for an accident or incident. I think I have heard that exact quote recited before, during, and after literally every single NTSB press conference in the history of NTSB press conferences. They are explicitly clear that they are not there to assign fault or blame for anything. They are there to learn, to figure out what happened and prevent it from happening again, hopefully. They are not there to assign blame and figure out who screwed up in the Boeing factory. That is something Boeing is going to have to figure out. To say explicitly the who is absolutely the responsibility of the NTSB is so far off base, it raises so many questions about what Boeing thinks it is supposed to be doing in this process, which is now, we'll get into the consequences.
Right. So you are absolutely not allowed to make statements like this about the investigation. And the NTSB is livid. So they sanctioned Boeing. They reminded Boeing that they are party to the investigation. And I'm not using party in a colloquial term. There is a specific legal definition of party to the investigation here, because that's how the NTSB operates. They are the investigative agency, and they allow associated entities to be a party to the investigation. So when it's an aircraft accident, it's often the aircraft manufacturer, it's often the engine manufacturer, or if there's a question of the avionics or something specific, it's the manufacturer of that particular item. It could be an airport if it was an airport incident, so on and so forth. In this case, Boeing is and has been party to many investigations. The NTSB helpfully provided the party agreement. Section 13 is titled Dissemination of Information to Media. And these are agreements that Boeing signed on January 7th, 2 days after the Alaska accident. I'm quoting from the Section 13 here. Here we go. Contacts with the news media concerning the investigation will be made only, and that's underlined and in bold on the NTSB's agreement, by the NTSB through the board member, if on scene, the NTSB's representative of its Office of Public Affairs, or the IIC, which stands for Investigator in Charge. The guiding policy is that the NTSB is a public agency engaged in the public's business and supported by public funds. The agency's work is open for public review, and the act under which it operates makes this mandatory. The NTSB believes that periodic factual briefings to the news media are a normal part of its investigation, and that for the public to perceive the investigation as credible, the investigation should speak with one voice, that being the independent agency conducting the investigation. Therefore, the NTSB insists that it be the sole source of public information regarding the progress of an accident investigation. Parties are encouraged to refer media inquiries to the NTSB's Office of Public Affairs. In any case, release to the media of investigative information at any times is grounds for removal as a party. The NTSB didn't go that far, though they threatened to do so if Boeing steps out of line even one more time. The NTSB is very close to turning this car around.
Oh, you never want that.
So what did they do? They said, we're not removing you as a party to the investigation, but Boeing no longer has access to the investigative docket, meaning that any information about the investigation that Boeing gets will come from the NTSB and the NTSB alone. Boeing will be subpoenaed by the NTSB to appear at the August 6th and 7th investigative hearing that had already been scheduled. Boeing will no longer be able to ask questions of any of the other hearing participants. So prior to this, they would have been able to engage with other hearing participants and ask questions and receive answers. The NTSB will interview Elizabeth Lund and will require her presence at the August hearing. The NTSB reminds Boeing that it's still subject to the party agreement, and because Boeing is the subject of an ongoing criminal investigation by the U.S. Department of Justice, the NTSB has notified the Justice Department of this, quote, unauthorized investigative information release.
And we'll get to that Department of Justice thing in a little bit, but I can't imagine it's going to have much impact on that. But this is a pretty stark list of impacts to Boeing here. None of these really amount to much of anything. It's a slap on the wrist, but after a slap on the wrist, if they do this again, being removed as a party to the investigation would be quite a big deal. I'm not really sure what would happen in that circumstance, but this is bad. Boeing should have known better. Someone in the position of Lund should have known better to not do this. As the NTSB said in their own words, Boeing has been in this situation many times as a party member to an investigation where they haven't violated this rule in the past that we know of, but to do so here was just a... Go on.
About that. So in the sanctions letter, the NTSB also addressed Boeing's chief engineer's comments about the recent 737, what the NTSB is terming an oscillation incident. So this was a Southwest 737 that experienced what the pilots described as Dutch roll. There, Boeing's chief engineer said that it had nothing to do with the design of the aircraft and was specific to that particular airplane. The NTSB said, you can't say that.
Yeah.
And so this is two sets of comments in quick succession that the NTSB is very, very...
And I think we mentioned that exactly last week about how you could possibly say it's not a design problem when that happened like last week or whatever like that. Right. You couldn't possibly know that yet. I guess I hadn't seen this, but I guess the NTSB would agree with us.
To NTSB's point, they said, we don't know that. We can't say that. We are the investigators. And we can't say that yet because we don't know. And you are not allowed to say that. So some strong words and some strong actions from the NTSB. I can't imagine that the fine folks at Boeing are having a good week after this. But I
Deep breath, deep breath.
exactly. I understand where Lund was coming from. They have Boeing, to their credit, has been to the best of their ability after January 5th, offering as much transparency regarding what happened, how it happened, and what they're doing to make sure it never happens again. And they've been doing that fairly okay. So I get where she's coming from. But there certainly would have been a way to answer those questions without upsetting the NTSB. And I think the biggest thing for the NTSB is they brought journalists in. They knew they were going to talk about this, and they did not tell the NTSB ahead of time.
I mean, there is the possibility that Boeing and Elizabeth Lund were under the impression that everything they were telling the media there were things that they already informed the NTSB of, that the NTSB knew all of these things. Maybe it's possible they didn't think there was anything here of interest, and none of this was new or relevant. I mean, of course it's relevant, but nothing new that the NTSB would object to. But I think that entire theory is thrown out the window when you get to that last part about saying, oh, the NTSB is going to figure out who screwed up. No, that's not what they do. So I think that theory, even if you were to say, oh, they thought all of this was already knowledge. Well, it doesn't matter because that thing you said at the end kind of screws that whole theory up.
Yeah. Let's move on to Boeing's legal troubles with the Department of Justice. So after the January 5th accident with Alaska Airlines, the United States Department of Justice revisited its deferred prosecution agreement with Boeing that it reached in 2021 following the crash of the Lion Air and Ethiopian Airlines 737 MAX aircraft. Because the Department of Justice found that Boeing had not adhered to the deferred prosecution agreement, it reopened the investigation and, first reported by Reuters, is now preparing to offer Boeing a further deal to plead guilty to criminal fraud charges. This would not be a deferred prosecution agreement, but they are offering Boeing a plea deal, or if they don't take the plea deal, by the end of the week, as is being reported, they could go to trial. The plea deal has been described by, and this is opposition lawyers, so take this with a grain of salt, a sweetheart deal, described as such by lawyers representing the families of the crashes of the 737 MAX aircraft. Here's what the AP is reporting the deal would contain. Boeing would have its probation period extended and an independent monitor to monitor Boeing's adherence to the deal would be appointed. However, the deal would include a monitor to oversee Boeing, but the company would put forward 3 nominees and have the Justice Department pick one or ask Boeing for additional names. That, the AP is reporting, is what families of the crash victims are most incensed about.
Yeah.
Or equally incensed by some of the other provisions here.
Yeah, some of the other provisions is Boeing would be on the hook for new fines, which, what else is new? $244 million additional fine, according to the New York Times, which, I don't know, at this point seems like a drop in the bucket, not all that much. The real tricky part here is that a company that is charged with a felony, found guilty of a felony, basically, is typically barred from federal contracts, which is kind of the death sentence for a company like Boeing. Boeing cannot sustain itself as a company without government contracts between defense and space and even commercial. I guess everything Boeing does would stop if it can't win U.S. government contracts anymore. But you know what? You can just get a waiver for that, and suddenly it's not a problem.
Yeah. So there's this on the table. Boeing has until the end of the week to decide what it's going to do. So I can't imagine them not pleading guilty.
There's no way they would want to go to trial. The only thing worse than this plea deal would be that the court of public opinion, and in this case, an actual courtroom, is just nobody would see this going in Boeing's direction. So take the deal.
we'll see what comes of this on next week's episode. So that was the bad news for Boeing. Now comes maybe good news?
I would hesitate to call this good news. It is just simply news. It's not good.
So Boeing, Airbus, and Spirit Aerosystems have all agreed in separate deals with Spirit. So Boeing and Spirit and Airbus and Spirit have agreed to deals that would allow Boeing to reacquire Spirit Aerosystems for approximately $4.7 billion.
In stock.
Yes, in stock at $37.25 a share. Total transaction value is approximately $8.3 billion, including debt. That is the Boeing side of the deal. So Boeing would take back Spirit Aerosystems, which produces roughly 70% of the 737. Airbus, on its side, will, and this is the second deal in which Boeing has done something that has allowed Airbus to pay $1. Airbus will buy back the Spirit work packages that produce A350 fuselage sections in Kinston, North Carolina and Saint-Nazaire, France, A220 wings and mid-fuselage in Belfast, Northern Ireland and Casablanca, Morocco, and the A220 pylons, which are produced at Spirit's Wichita, Kansas plant. Airbus will be compensated for its troubles. Airbus will receive $559 million from Spirit Aerosystems in exchange for $1.
Isn't that great that not only does Airbus now get to control its own destiny with the parts of Spirit Aerosystems that impacted its own production, but they got a $559 million check in the process. So that really does sound like a win-win, but at the end of the day, Airbus contracted out to Spirit to do a thing that either didn't want to do or didn't have the capability to do or thought Spirit could do better itself. Now Boeing's got to deal with that. I'm sorry. Now Airbus has to deal with this. And now
Boeing has to deal with it too. They both have to deal with it.
Exactly. I mean, that's what I wanted to say, that this isn't particularly good news. It's the end of the beginning of the saga. The easy part is over. The financials are presumably done. Now Boeing, a deeply, deeply troubled company, has to fix another deeply, deeply troubled company. And that's not going to be easy.
Yeah. It's going to be really tough. Long road ahead.
And there are other entities that rely on Spirit Aerosystem. They did not only produce also Airbus parts, but I think Bombardier for the private jets and Sikorsky for helicopters. Spirit made all sorts of other stuff for other manufacturers.
If you build an airplane, Spirit Aerosystems has a piece in it.
Right. Airbus was just the 800-pound gorilla in the room or whatever. Like, that had to be dealt with. You can't have Boeing making Airbus parts. That's just not tenable. But all the other stuff, Boeing's now got to figure out what to do with that. Do they make stuff for Sikorsky and for Bombardier? I don't know. We already know that Boeing doesn't really like Bombardier. But now this is something that they have to deal with, and that's not going to be easy while simultaneously righting the ship. So Spirit, or what was Spirit, doesn't deliver airplanes with snowman holes in it anymore. The easy part's done. The actual, true, very difficult part is just now beginning, and it's going to take a very long time to figure out.
Yes. So stay tuned for more on this story. It's going to be a long one.
Man, really got to admire Airbus for pulling out these $1 Bob deals. Just how does that keep happening? Presumably, I mean, Airbus probably gets all of the tooling, all of the machinery, all of the people who are on those lines building those parts for them for $1 minus $530 something million?
$559 million.
That's a good deal, I think.
It's not. Because here's the thing. All of these work packages were losing money.
Well, now it's not a problem for Boeing. It's an Airbus problem.
It's an Airbus. I mean, it continues to be an everybody problem. But let's move on to a problem that was just a problem for passengers on Air Europa Flight 45, which was on its way from Madrid to Montevideo when it experienced We're not sure exactly the grading of the turbulence, but it was bad enough that one passenger ended up in the ceiling above the overhead bins.
That was one of the most shocking things I've seen in a long time. That we are all desensitized to violence and shocking things. But when I watched that video and it panned up to the ceiling and there were feet dangling out of what looked like the space above the overhead bin in the ceiling, and there were just legs dangling there. That was one of the most shocking things I've seen in a long time, because I just don't know how that happens, but it happened.
It happened. A podcast listener, his father was on the flight. And so he wrote in right after to let us know what had happened. And so we started following the story. Thankfully, his father's okay. A few bumps and bruises. He was checked out. The flight diverted to Natal. And then Air Europa sent a replacement aircraft to Recife. So they had to take a bus from Natal to Recife. And then they went on to Montevideo. So 7 people suffered serious enough injuries to be taken to the hospital. None appear to be life-threatening, so that's the good news here. But some wild pictures from inside the aircraft. Not only the person who ended up in the ceiling, but also the damage to one of the seats, where the seat was broken forward.
It does not bend that way typically. Not supposed to, at least.
We'll put a link in the show notes to some of the photos and videos from on board the aircraft, but very glad to hear that injuries were not more numerous and more severe. The past couple of weeks, we've been talking about Southwest Airlines because they've been having a rough go of it lately, whether operationally or safety incidents, and well, this
financially
week's not any better. Too. Financially, yes. This week's not so much better. A Southwest Airlines 737 took off from the Portland Jetport, closed runway. It gets better. There was a vehicle on said runway.
It gets better. Keep going.
Does it get better or does it get worse?
It gets worse because that flight wasn't communicating with anyone at the airport at the time. And there's some nuance there. And we'll talk about the nuance and the complications of a flight departing from an airport where the air traffic control tower is not actually open for the day yet. So it gets a little complicated. But what happened here was Southwest 4805 was departing Portland Jetport in the minutes, literally the few minutes before the air traffic control tower opened for the day, which is not, you might be thinking, how could flights operate from an airport that doesn't have an operational air traffic control tower? And it's actually more common than you might think. And there are very, very strict and supposed to be followed rules for how a flight operates at this. Basically, since they can't talk to the local air traffic control tower because there might not be anyone up there, I think they talked to the ARTCC, is it? Or the local en route center to get takeoff clearance. And in this case, that's what they did. And they were given a takeoff clearance that was only valid for 3 minutes, because any longer than that, the tower would open and they'd have to get a clearance from the tower and start that whole process over. But all of this is fine and ordinary. The problem is that for whatever reason, they also were not communicating at all on the mandatory frequency. So what happens here is that there's obviously no air traffic controller to talk to at the airport. So what they do is they broadcast over the common air traffic frequency. I think it was CTAF, is it?
Yeah, Common Traffic Advisory Frequency.
Thank you. That's it. And if you listen to the live ATC recording, which we'll link to in the show notes, of course, take a note of that, Ian, you can hear other pilots departing around the same time explicitly stating over the radio to nobody and anybody in particular exactly what they're doing. Hey, we're pushing back. Hey, we're starting up our engines. Hey, we're taxiing out to the runway. Hey, we are crossing over closed runway 29. I think it was 29. Hey, we're departing. Hey, we're clear of the runway. Southwest wasn't doing any of that. Either they weren't broadcasting at all, which is all sorts of alarming, or it's possible that they were broadcasting on the wrong frequency, which is better, but still not good, because they probably should have been wondering, hey, why aren't we hearing any of the other pilots moving about the airport over our radio? Very, very odd. Or maybe they were keying the wrong microphone and they were talking and just nothing was going out. But I think what was kind of most egregious is that once they got in the air and they were in touch with air traffic control. They said, hey, you took off from a runway that wasn't quite open yet. And the pilots just said, oh, no, we have different information. The runway was open. No, it wasn't. You took off before 5:45 local. I think they took off 5:43 a.m. local. The runway was not open. Yeah. And instead of saying, oh, no, what happened? How did that happen? They just basically said, no, we didn't. Huh? It's not a disputable fact. I mean, time is a fixed thing. It's the same for everyone.
Does Southwest use different clocks?
I mean, maybe their clocks were set incorrectly on the 7-3. I don't know. But when provided with information of, hey, you took off before the runway was open, the correct response is, no, we didn't. Okay.
Okay.
This is the next entry in a list of incidents Southwest has had in a very short period of time. And we talked about this, Ian, off the show a couple weeks ago, or maybe not a couple weeks ago, a couple days ago. It just, everything kind of feels longer than it really is these days, that it really feels like Southwest at this point should be the airline under closer scrutiny from the FAA rather than United, which had a spat of like run-of-the-mill maintenance things that were magnified by the media. In this case, we have actual verifiable, very concerning pilot incidents, but there's no increased oversight that we're aware of in this case, and I'd like to know why not.
That's a
you
great
don't have
question.
an answer. You don't have the answer. I'm just posing that.
I can only say that's a great question. I will say that the NTSB and FAA are investigating this particular incident, so we might be talking about another set of monitorings on next week's episode.
Maybe. And yet again, of course, I'm sure the NTSB will come out and say, well, the cockpit voice recorder was overwritten for this flight, because of course it was. The flight was longer than 2 hours, I believe, or it would have been overwritten anyway, because the crew didn't think they did anything wrong, rightfully or wrongfully. So I'm not really sure what the NTSB will end up doing here, but they will not have the benefit of the cockpit voice recorder, because of course they won't.
Yeah. One day we'll have longer than 2
maybe.
hours. Let's go to the commercial portion of the podcast. We'll start with the European Commission giving its conditional approval to the Lufthansa Group acquisition of ITA Airways. Lufthansa is going to initially take a 41% stake. Then it will have options to exercise as early as 2025 to acquire the whole thing. So Lufthansa, for its part, says that it's looking to close this deal in the fourth quarter of this year. In order for the deal to go through, the European Commission said you have to give up some concessions. And Lufthansa said, what do you have in mind? And the European Commission says, how about some slots in Milan? And then if you're competing on routes between Italy and Germany now, you have to let a competitor fly those routes. And Lufthansa said, oh, that sounds so awful. You're hamstringing us. No. It's going to be terrible. And then they laughed all the way to acquiring the airline.
Yes, there are some additional proposed remedies, most of which I don't think are nearly strong enough here, considering just how large of an airline group Lufthansa Group is now. But there are commitments for short-haul routes, commitments for long-haul routes, and then commitments specifically for Milan Linate Airport. Lufthansa and the MEF, which I think is the Ministry of Economy and Finance within Italy, who I think was the owner of ITA at this point. But basically they will make, I may have been making that up at this point, but I'm pretty sure that's right. But Lufthansa and the MEF will have to make available, and I'm quoting here, to one or two rival airlines the necessary assets to enable them to start nonstop flights between Rome or Milan and certain airports in Central Europe. That is a very, very wishy-washy, non-specific statement that, one or two airlines will start up between Italy and like somewhere in Europe. I don't know. Whatever takers of those slots would need to operate them for, and again, quote, a certain minimum period. Don't know what that period is. The Lufthansa and the MEF will transfer takeoff and landing slots at Linate Airport, and this is the big one, to the remedy takers for the short-haul routes. The number of slots to be divested exceeds what is necessary to operate the short-haul routes, as well as number of slots that the transaction would have added to ITA's portfolio. So we don't have a firm number, but it would have to be enough to sustain an actual operational base at Linate, which really could just be a few aircraft. to start up an operation like that. But also there's some long haul agreements of they got to start up some interline agreements or slot swaps. The whole thing is just very, very not specific. That Lufthansa is going to have to do some things for some airlines, but nothing really specific. I was really hoping the EU would be a lot more prescriptive about exactly what's going to happen here. I was also hoping they would say they'd have to rebrand the airline to Alitalia, but that doesn't seem to happen.
That doesn't sound like it's going to happen. But the ownership of Alitalia still exists. The ownership of the Alitalia brand still exists out there. So you never know.
It could happen.
It could happen. American Airlines has placed a conditional order for 100 ZeroAvia hydrogen fuel cell powertrains. So enough for 50 regional jets. American previously invested in ZeroAvia in 2022. ZeroAvia's first and much smaller powertrain, hydrogen powertrain, is expected to enter service next year in the 10 to 20 seat aircraft market. Then there will be a larger turbo powertrain for kind of slightly larger aircraft coming around 2027. And then 2029 is when the largest powertrains that American is ordering will enter service. So we're still a ways off from any hydrogen fuel cell powertrains powering American Airlines regional jets. But they seem to think that ZeroAvia has got a winning formula, and they're investing more money and placing orders for it. On the other side of the hydrogen powered aircraft, Universal Hydrogen was not able to secure any additional funding and has decided that they are going to close up shop for good.
Yeah, and Universal Hydrogen was the outfit, I think, out of Washington State that took at one point one of the Dash 8s from Alaska Horizon, which again, Alaska Horizon doesn't operate Dash 8s anymore, so that was always odd timing. But Universal Hydrogen just couldn't cut it, and part of that is just because of how much space on board these aircraft it takes to house the hydrogen on board, which I guess I could see American's point here that maybe it works better on regional jets because, let's face it, if you're looking at Delta and United, they are both operating 76, 75 seat CRJ 700s down to 50 seats due to flight attendant reasons and scope clause and all that. So they're already taking out 20-something seats on board those aircraft. And instead of making them kind of luxury liners with nice legroom and extra space for bags and an extra large first class, maybe you take those space for those 20 seats and put in some hydrogen tanks. Maybe that makes sense. I don't know.
Maybe that makes sense.
Maybe. I don't know. But the road ahead for a hydrogen powered aircraft seems very, very questionable. But American sees something it likes.
Well, we'll keep an eye on it for the next
decade,
almost 10 years. In additional bad news, Bonza has formally entered liquidation. The former Australian low-cost carrier was unable to secure, administrators for the former carrier were unable to secure anyone willing to buy the airline. The only silver lining here with the liquidation is that employees who had gone unpaid thus far since the airline stopped flying will now receive financial compensation from the Australian government.
Sad. It's never great to hear about a story that ends so abruptly and without much assistance. But from the ashes of one airline, being Bonza, who had 8 737 MAXs, comes the news that Air Canada will acquire 8 more 73 MAX 8s. Seems like an interesting coincidence there. Yeah, they said these will come from BOC Aviation. I'm not sure if Bonza was leasing from BOC. I'm actually not quite sure about that, but they did say these aircraft will be coming to the Air Canada fleet in a terrible, terrible one-cabin, all-economy, maximum capacity layout, which matches Bonza. So maybe that's it. Maybe we're transferring Australia to Canada.
Australia to Canada.
I don't know. Air Canada is kind of strapped for aircraft between the issues with the A220 and all sorts of other stuff going on. Boeing not being able to deliver as many aircraft as they said they would be. What else is new? Air Canada has pulled some rather elderly aircraft from the desert. It has We often see Air Canada Rouge aircraft here substituting in for Air Canada Mainline in New York, which is not great. So Air Canada it probably paid a good penny for these aircraft, but it seems quite coincidental that 8 aircraft out of Banzai Air, 8 aircraft into Air Canada.
They're not the Banzai aircraft. It is purely coincidental.
Is it? Do you know that?
Yeah, none of them are coming from Banzai. Or I shouldn't say none, but it doesn't look like any of them are BOC.
Well, they're coming from somewhere.
So possibly Lynx?
I don't know, but I don't think those were with BOC either, but we'll see.
Well, now I've got some homework for the week. On the order front, Cebu Pacific, which had been promising a historic and blockbuster order, has gone, fairly big.
It's pretty big. Not in order.
Not in order. It is a memorandum of understanding for up to 152 Airbus A321neos. They will all seat 900 people each. The MOU will include that's a joke, Jason.
Mm-hmm.
I don't actually mean 900 people each.
I mean, maybe. I don't know.
I feel the staring through the...
It's Cebu Pacific, so it's possible. They did go through that phase where they just put as many human beings in every one of their aircraft as possible. I think they come down a little bit on that, but 900 seems possible.
A little bit. The MOU, when finalized, will be a firm order for 102 A321neos and 50 options. And they have already announced that they have selected the Pratt & Whitney 1100G engines.
Yeah, good luck with that.
152 aircraft.
Maybe they're hoping by what do these aircraft start delivering in 2029, I think? Maybe by 2029, they're confident that Pratt will figure its nonsense out.
One would hope.
I mean, maybe.
Elsewhere, Turkish Cargo has ordered 4 new 777 freighters, I believe, bringing their total up to 12.
Good for them, I guess. Yeah. I don't know.
I mean, I like it when
we have no insight here. We just wanted to mention it because more 777s is more better.
More 777s, more better. Interesting. These are the standard 777, the existing 777 freighters. These are not the 777X freighters, the 777-8 based freighter. So yeah, this will bring Turkish up to a full dozen. So good for them. New Pacific Airways, formerly, what were they called before?
Oh, wow. The rebranding worked so well. You can't even remember the name.
Or they're so memorable. I can't even remember the name. Northern Pacific. They got in trouble for being Northern Pacific Airways. This was the airline that was started as a Iceland Air of the West in order to use Alaska as a stopover point between the west coast of the United States and destinations in Asia. This was all started, and then so many things made that not possible, including securing aircraft, not being able to fly over Russia, not having ETOPS approvals. So CEO Rob McKinney is gone. And this is a quote from the Flight Global article on the subject. A representative for McKinney said on the 1st of July that the split comes as he, quote, does not share the forward vision of ownership and chairman. New Pacific Airways has now jumped both feet into the charter market, and that's not where the airline initially started. And so it sounds like McKinney doesn't see himself as a part of that.
Alrighty.
So he's gone.
They pivoted quite quickly from let's scrap together whatever little routes we can in the Southwest, not the Pacific, not Northern Pacific, but the Southwest. They tried some things, didn't really work out. They stopped and they pivoted to the lucrative charter business. And I guess McKinney just said, I don't know, this is boring. I want to work for a commercial airline or something. And he's out. Too bad. They had I liked their vision. I was really kind of rooting for them because if it could work to Europe, why can't it work to Asia?
Sure.
Why not? And it was 757s. I mean, what's there not to like? It's
a good looking plane. I'll give them that.
It is, but now it's not for us to worry about because it is not in the commercial space, so we no longer care about it.
Speaking of no longer in the commercial space, but desperately trying to get back, Cargologic Air was a UK-based 747 cargo operator that entered administration following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, because Cargologic Air was linked to Volga-Dnieper Group, and so they lost their ability to operate these aircraft. Well, it turns out that they also lost access to all of their financial records and maintenance records for the aircraft because they were storing them with Microsoft. And Microsoft, quote, deprovisioned their Microsoft online subscriptions.
I don't know what that means, but apparently the outcome of that is they deleted everything.
So the administrators for Cargologic Air have no idea how much money the airline is owed and how much money the airline owes, nor do they really know what their assets are because they don't have access to their books. They also don't have digital records for the maintenance facilities and things like that for these 747s, so they can return them to the lessors.
Well, yeah, that would be good because I don't know how anyone can operate these aircraft if they're transferred to anyone else without literally any of the records. I mean, there must be paper somewhere that they could.
There's paperwork, but all of the digital records are apparently gone. So hopefully they can resolve that. But yeah, wow, that's a giant pain.
Yeah, kind of sounds like the plot of the TV show Mr. Robot, where all of the digital records of everything were deleted, and they spend years reassembling everything from the old archived paper records. But hopefully they can, I don't know, Microsoft can snap their fingers and figure out how to get it back. This also happened to I think a financial company a few months ago where Google accidentally just deleted literally everything to the company. There weren't sanctions or anything. There was some misprovision again, and everything disappeared. But thankfully, that company had backups upon backups upon backups of its data, which apparently this airline in this case did not.
Just doesn't.
Don't trust the cloud. Even if you're an airline, you should know not to trust clouds. Clouds are always up to no good.
To trust a cloud. There you go. Just a reminder for some upcoming events. I will be at Oshkosh at AirVenture on the 27th of July. I'll be up there on the the Saturday all day. So we're doing a live stream with our friends at Infinite Flight at 10 a.m. from their booth. And then I'll be out and about for the rest of the day. So if you're going to be up there, give us a shout. Email us at podcast@fr24.com and we can find a time to meet up. We're sending our colleague Chris to Farnborough for a few days. He'll be there on the Wednesday and Thursday of the show. So if you're going to be there, also send us an email and we can put you in contact if you want to meet up there. And as we look forward to the rest of the summer, we'll keep you posted on any other events that may be happening. But for now, this has been episode 275 of AvTalk. I am Ian Petchnick, here as always with
Jason Rabinowitz. Thanks for listening.